So the prelim report has some interesting information here. Something we suspected that we reported quite a bit on was the idea that we had a right seat pilot on the Citation II who was not certified. So on left seat was Dutton Sr. He was an airline transport rated pilot in the left seat, and his adult son, who held a private pilot certificate, single engine land and instrument rating, was the passenger in the right seat. That would be Dutton's son, Jack. Rear seat passenger with private pilot certificate and ratings for multi-engine land, instrument airplane, rotorcraft helicopter was positioned near the cockpit in the cabin area. That would be Biffle. So Biffle was sitting right behind the two pilots. In the left seat, you had Dutton Sr., who was certified, rated for that aircraft for the Citation II, had 17,000 hours of flight time, former airline pilot, former Delta pilot. His son was sitting next to him in the right seat, who had 170-something hours of flight time, all in single-engine, light piston aircraft, definitely was not qualified for that seat. And then behind them, you had Biffle, who was qualified. Most likely, they don't state here whether he was qualified to sit in the right seat or not. I think he was probably qualified to sit in the right seat. He had the proper training in the Citation II to sit in the right seat, and he had a multi-engine rating, and that would have qualified him under Part 91 domestic operations to sit in that seat. So we kind of suspected that early on, and that has been validated, confirmed here. So they start with the engine start here, and there's something here that maybe is related. So they were started using onboard battery power. In Citation II, they probably have what's called starter generators, something I'm familiar with, I've used in the past. It is a starter. The motor there actually acts as a starter, so it produces rotational forces to start the engine, and then once the engine's started, you have to flip a switch to turn it into a generator, at which point it starts actually dragging against rotation to produce electricity. So a starter generator, I'm guessing, is what they have aboard the Citation. The engine was started using onboard battery power, which would be normal. There was an unsuccessful start of the number one engine. We don't know if this is going to be a factor later or not. They did report some engine issues on the CVR. There was a discussion. We'll get into that in a minute. But they couldn't start the number one engine initially. Eventually, they were able to start the number one engine. Both engines were started 9:53, not long before taking off. So taxied to the runway to take off. During taxi, the pilot and two pilot-rated passengers, so Jack Dutton in the right seat and then Biffle, Greg Biffle sitting behind him, discussed the thrust reverser indicator lights for an unspecified engine was inoperative. That doesn't appear to be a factor, but it was mentioned by them that the thrust reverser light for one of the engines was inoperative, which would illuminate if the thrust reverser was extended, producing reverse thrust, which is used for landing predominantly to decelerate the aircraft on landing. But otherwise, the thrust reverser for the affected engine was working properly. So the light wasn't working, but the thrust reverser was apparently working properly. That was the discussion. So they took off from the runway. Once airborne, the pilot performed takeoff and departure, while the right seat pilot, Dutton's son, performed various checklists and communications on the radio. Jack Dutton was communicating on the radio and then was performing checklists. During the takeoff roll, the rear passenger commented that the left engine was producing more power than the right and indicated there may have been a faulty gauge. The pilot continued the takeoff. So we got to stop there just for a second. Bad engine indications, whether they're related to a gauge or related to some potential issue with the engine, is generally a reason to reject a takeoff. And at the airline level, we have a briefing. It's a briefing that doesn't change from flight to flight to flight. There's 4 items that I always brief, and this is a standard of the airline I work for. So anything prior to 80 knots, we will reject. Any issues whatsoever prior to 80 knots, we'll reject. Above 80 knots, we'll only reject for 4 items. Any fire indications, any engine failure, the ability to control the aircraft in question, or a wind shear alert. Those are only 4 things I'm going to reject above 80 knots, and that's compliant with FAA recommendations, NTSB recommendations as well, that reject takeoffs above 80 knots a lot of times end up creating accidents themselves. So you really want to limit, especially on a twin-engine aircraft, you want to limit what you're going to reject above 80 knots for. And then V1, after V1, this takeoff safety speed, we're going to go flying. If we need to come back around and make a landing, we'll take the thing airborne, come back around and make an immediate landing if we need to. They just say during the takeoff roll, so it's not articulated at one point what speed they were at. When Biffle, the rear passenger, commented the left engine was producing more power than the right and that there may have been a faulty gauge. If this was below 80 knots, they should have rejected the takeoff. I don't care if I have a bad instrument or a bad engine. I really don't care. Even above 80 knots with abnormal engine indications, you could justify rejecting the takeoff. Say, this engine may be failing right now, and that's one of the reasons I'll reject a takeoff above 80 knots. Probably the takeoff should have been rejected. Doesn't matter whether it's a bad gauge or a bad engine, it should have been rejected. So I don't want to second guess them too much. We don't know. This could have been very high speed in the takeoff roll and make more sense if it was, and they didn't reject the takeoff. But if you're counting right now, we've got 3 significant risk factors. Number one, Jack Dutton is sitting in the right seat. He's not qualified for the right seat. He doesn't have a multi-engine rating. He has very low time pilot. Probably, given the conditions here, he had not familiarized himself sufficiently with the Citation II, which means checklist usage, abnormal procedures, things of that nature. Just was basically he could handle the radios and he could read off of a checklist and probably not do much more. That's not someone you want in the right seat in a turbojet high-performance aircraft. So that's risk number one. That was self-induced. That was induced by Dutton Sr., and by Biffle himself. They were obviously trying to let father and son fly together. You can understand the sentiment of that. You can appreciate the, Biffle wanting to give them that, Dutton Sr. wanting to have that experience with his son. But at the end of the day, aviation isn't about sentiment, it's about safety. This was a bad safety decision. So big risk, self-induced risk, a non-qualified pilot in the right seat. Number two, thrust reverser indicator light that was not working. That's a risk factor as well. It doesn't appear to have played a role in this, but it is a risk factor. Number three, you're taking off. You have indications either of a bad gauge or of some sort of abnormality between the two engines. You continue the takeoff. Those are 3 risk factors right there. There were a lot of folks who felt like this sort of curving pattern and descent at the end of this curving pattern indicated that the pilot was attempting an immediate return to land on runway 10. That would indicate potentially some sort of engine failure was the idea in the early coverage around here. We know now that's not the case. There's no comment of an engine failure, even though they had abnormal engine indications. There's no indication of an engine failure through the CVR conversation that they had preceding this. So no one stated that there was any sort of engine failure here, which they would have if that had occurred. We know at this point that they were starting to enter into the clouds in a climb, and they were VFR departure. We'll get into that in a minute, but on a VFR departure, you need to have an instrument clearance. You need to be IFR, which calls instrument flight rules. They were VFR, visual flight rules, which meant that they had to stay clear of clouds. They had to have visibility to identify any other air traffic that was out there and avoid that air traffic. IFR, you get into radar contact with, in this case, would be Atlanta Center that controlled the airspace over Statesville Airport, and you would talk to them. They'd get you in radar contact. They'd keep you clear of other aircraft, and then you could go climb into the clouds because you would have clearance with the other aircraft provided by air traffic control services. So they began the descent here to stay out of the clouds, which is interesting. They had already decided, particularly with Biffle and Dutton's son in the right seat, to fly and kind of to break the regulations to fly, but they didn't want to violate the regulations. At least Dutton Sr. didn't want to violate the regulations and fly into the clouds, VMC into IMC. He didn't want to do that, VFR into IFR. So the descent here was to stay out of the clouds, was not indicative of an engine failure. And we'll get more into that later because there never was any indication in the CVR, according to the NTSB, of an engine failure. But the CVR was a little bit compromised, so we don't know whether there's an engine failure. Right now, it looks like there was not an engine failure, even though there are abnormal engine indications. So the right seat pilot here, who would be Jack Dutton, attempted to contact ZTL ATC, that would be Atlanta Center, to activate the IFR flight plan 3 times in a couple of minutes. Was unsuccessful due to the workload and associated radio communication. So the controller was talking to a lot of different traffic. He just wasn't able to get a hold of him to get that IFR flight plan open, which meant they were still VFR and they were trying to stay below the clouds. Now, 10:09, there's discussion between Dutton Sr., rear passenger, Biffle, about climbing to a higher altitude, even though they're technically required to remain VFR. Let's talk about that for a second. We'll zip down here. So this is the weather that they received from the airport in the aircraft before taking off at 9:54. This is right before they started the engines. So wind 0503 knots, not much wind. Visibility 10, that means at least 10 miles of visibility. 3,900 foot scattered, ceiling 5,000 overcast. So their decision to depart VFR and then attempt to pick up their IFR flight plan in the air was most likely based upon this report, which is we can climb as high as 5,000 feet. So we can climb up to 4,500 feet, and that's safe altitude. We're not worried about any obstructions. We're not worried about antennas. We're not worried about other stuff like that on the ground. We can climb up to 4,500 feet, below 5,000 feet, and then we can cruise down here to the degree that we need to until we can get a hold of center, get our IFR clearance, and get the climb through the clouds. Well, when they came back for landing at 10:15, the weather was 5 statute miles, heavy drizzle, ceiling broken 1,200 feet and 2,200 feet, and then overcast of 5,000 feet. So effectively, 1,200 to 2,200 feet, you were done. You couldn't climb any higher than that. And that's not really a fun altitude. 1,500 feet was essentially what they wound up leveling off at. That's not a great altitude in a multi-engine jet around hill country in North Carolina. You're worried about antennas, large antennas, AM antennas, things like that. You're not in a comfortable state. And so likely they had this first report. They said, hey, we're good. We can go VFR. We don't have to make a phone call to Atlanta Center. We don't have to potentially deal with the delay in getting our clearance, IFR clearance before we take off. Places like Statesville, if they don't have radar services down to the ground, which they probably didn't, are what we call one-in, one-out airports, which means that air traffic control will not clear an aircraft to depart until they have no IFR aircraft in the area. And that can induce delays in getting out of an airport, that you've got to wait minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes for an approaching aircraft to land and cancel their IFR, or for a departing aircraft to be radar contacted by ATC before you can get your clearance to leave. And become more complicated if there's not radio services on the ground from Atlanta Air Traffic Control Center to the pilot. If you just have a phone number, for example, it becomes even more complicated. And so it's much simpler to depart VFR. It could be much more expedient to depart VFR, pick up that IFR clearance en route. Now, if they knew ceiling was broken 1,200 feet, 2,200 feet, overcast 5,000 feet, if they had that weather information, if they knew that the weather was going to degrade to that point before they took off, they probably would have gotten that IFR clearance on the ground. It would be pretty aggressive to take off under those conditions and attempt to pick up that clearance immediately after takeoff in a very high workload while remaining at a very low, really kind of unsafe altitude for maneuvering. So again, they had this discussion, Biffle and Dutton Sr. I kind of feel like it may have been Biffle who suggested, hey, we already got an illegal guy in the right seat. Let's just punch through these clouds. What are the odds that we'll hit an aircraft in the clouds, climbing out? It's not legal. It's not suggested. You do have a race car driver in the back seat who has a different risk assessment ratio. He's saying we already kind of violated one thing. Maybe we should climb through the clouds. They don't specify who said what. I imagine it's Biffle. If it had been Dutton Sr., you'd think Dutton Sr. just would have climbed through the clouds because he was the one flying the airplane. But they decided to remain VFR as opposed to punch through those clouds. And, you can only judge it by the result, which is they probably were better to illegally climb into IMC or exercise emergency authority to climb into IMC. They sort of put themselves in that position, though. There's really no justification for it. But they had a discussion about it, decided to, at this point, they had descended to 1,580 feet MSL, which was not that high above the ground, 958.6 feet elevation for runway 10. So 960-ish feet elevation. This is MSL. So 1,580 feet means they were 500 feet off the ground. They're cruising along 500 feet off the ground. Not a safe altitude. Not a safe altitude. There's plenty of antennas out there that are more than 580 feet. There's hills out there. There's all sorts of bad mojo out there. I think at that point, you are basically an emergency aircraft. And if you're an emergency aircraft, you can violate regulations. It's not ideal. Whoever said, hey, maybe we should punch through this cloud, even though we're VFR, was probably correct. You're an emergency aircraft at that point. So eventually, pilot initiated climb. So it wasn't long afterwards before I think they said, oh, the heck with it. We just need to climb through this. And then the rear passenger, Biffle, noted the left-right engine interstage turbine temperature indications. There was a difference between the two. Don't know if that was abnormal for this particular aircraft or not. I've flown a lot of turbojets. Depending upon the age and wear of the different engines, ITTs can be different. So The fan speed generally is what produces a thrust. In order to get symmetric thrust, which means both fan speeds are at about the same rate, sometimes you need a little higher interstage temperature in one engine as opposed to the other. So if you have an engine that's in better tolerances, generally an engine that is newer compared to an older engine, the older engine may be a little bit more out of tolerances, which means it's not as efficient, which means you need to burn more fuel, produce more heat to produce the same thrust. So it's not altogether unusual for that to take place. It's possible in this aircraft that Biffle wasn't used to seeing that, and that might have indicated some sort of an engine issue. It's possible that that was maybe normal. You just had a differential in terms of the efficiencies of the two engines, so the ITTs were a little bit different. We have no idea. The NTSB doesn't comment within the preliminary report as to whether that indicated some sort of engine issue or not. So we don't know. We don't know at this point in time, but there was no indication of an engine failure. So we're not quite sure what was going on with the engines, but two separate comments during takeoff. There was a differential in thrust between one engine and the other. That may have been associated with the ITT if you had set the interstage turbine temps instead of the N1s, and you set those turbine temps comparably to each other. One engine may have been more efficient, producing more thrust than the other. After takeoff, if you equalize those engines from an N1 perspective, the ITTs may have been different. So it may have been the same thing expressed in two different ways. We don't know whether that indicated an issue or not with the engines. The NTSB isn't stating whether or not there was any indications of an engine issue at that point in time. So this is where we get into, and we get back into the starter generator question here. The autopilot was either disengaged intentionally or it disengaged independently at 10:10. And then at 10:18, cockpit area microphone captured pilot making remarks indicating his altitude indicator was not working properly and that additional left side instruments may not have been working properly. The avionics package for the aircraft, the Garmin GTN 750, which comes with a memory card. Fortunately, I guess it wasn't damaged enough that they weren't able to recover data from it. So they're stating the data they recovered from that memory card stopped recording airspeed data at 10:09:37 and heading data at 10:10:58, which would validate the left seat pilot, Dutton Sr., the ATP, former airline pilot, saying, hey, I don't have airspeed indications. I don't have heading. I have bad indications over here. I have bad indications. Maybe in IMC, in instrument meteorological conditions at that point in time, so it's a really bad time not to have those indications. Not long after that, airplane control was transferred to the right seat passenger, which is Dutton's son, not certified, not familiar with it, doesn't have a multi-engine rating, probably doesn't know much about any of the operating limitations, airspeed limitations, control characteristics of the Citation II, but he's got good instruments in front of him. So if they're in IMC at this point in time, Dutton Sr. doesn't have good airspeed indication, Dutton's son does. He transfers the controls to him. A horrible situation, probably correct in that moment to transfer the controls over to his son. But you've stacked the deck seriously against you by putting Jack, who was just not capable to be in that seat, and now he's got to fly the airplane. No comments were recorded during the remainder of the CVR to indicate any malfunctions of right seat cockpit flight instruments. So we'll assume the right seat instruments were functioning, although if they weren't, I don't know that Jack Dutton would have necessarily have been able to articulate that or known the difference. So within a few seconds of this, severe degradation in CVR audio quality began on all channels, which continued for 3 minutes and 5 seconds. So the number one microphone began to degrade about 50 seconds prior to all the channels degrading. And we'll get into in a minute, something happens that brings that CVR audio back, which indicates there may have been an electrical issue associated on this flight. So about 10:13, a couple minutes after that, the pilot and both pilot-rated passengers stated they could see the ground. So they were trying to make a return to the airport. There was no positive control of the airplane. So there was no, hey, my aircraft, your aircraft. We generally do that if there's two pilots. You're going to fly the aircraft, I say your aircraft, and you respond my aircraft. There was no positive transfer of airplane control, but subsequent communication indicated that Dutton Sr. had taken the controls back. Once he could see the ground, he took the controls back from his son and then flew the aircraft without good flight instruments on his side of the aircraft. Now, he probably could have seen the instruments on his son's side of the aircraft, but that's an awkward sort of transition to look, and you're only seeing it kind of from the side. You don't get it full on, and to do that sort of scan is unnatural. It's an unnatural type of scan to do. But since the son wasn't qualified to fly the aircraft, Dutton Sr. had to take control of the aircraft back and fly it without good airspeed indications. And this is going to be critical. He didn't have good airspeed indications in front of him. So they blast off out of here. They come all the way around here. Out here, they're scud running, basically staying below the clouds. Somewhere around here, they say, hey, 500 feet isn't good. We're basically in an emergency. We're going to climb into the clouds. I think that's probably what happened. Start climbing the clouds. Oh, no. I've lost my gauges on the left seat. I have to transfer controls. Then they say, let's go back to the airport. We're not going to continue flying like this. Come back around. They begin a descent. They get visual contact with the ground towards the airport. Transfer of controls once again takes place. Dutton Sr. is flying the aircraft now. Then you have the audio that we have of some issues by Jack Dutton, his son. CVR audio quality returns. We're going to talk about in a second. And then his son, Dutton's son, actually saw the airport first and told his father about it. At 10:14:05, rear passenger made a query to the pilot regarding power to the alternator. There's a note here. There's no alternator in the CE 550. It's kind of a pedantic note. What Biffle was referring to there, I believe, is a starter generator. Generator does the same thing as an alternator in a different way. It provides electricity to aircraft systems. So about 4 seconds later, and this is a big one, audio quality returned to previous levels on all recorded CVR audio channels. And that is a good indication right there, I think, of there was either one or both of the starter generator switches weren't in generator. The generator was not turned on. Biffle makes the statement, hey, I think we have an electrical issue here. I don't think the generator, the alternator's on. And then, you just flip the switch. 4 seconds later, bang, CVR audio channels are working again, which indicates you have full electrical power back to the aircraft. So after audio quality returned, pilot made a comment indicating that was the problem. He said, well, that was the problem. That's what we were dealing with was the problem. However, he didn't specify what it was or what actions were taken to correct it. I think flipping one of the generators or both generator switches was what he did to correct that issue. I suspect it was just one generator switch. I imagine, and I'm not a Citation II guy, but I imagine the Citation II would be giving you all sorts of alerts if you were on battery power during takeoff. So I think probably one generator was powered. The other wasn't. If there's segregation in the different electrical systems, you have a left electrical system, a right electrical system. The battery may have been providing power to one system. I don't know the exact architecture of the Citation II. If you do, you can drop a comment below. But either one or both generators were probably turned on into generation mode at that point and solved some of the problems. Although what they specify here, there's no additional discussions regarding pilot's flight instrumentation for the remainder of the CVR recording. So if the issues with the flight instrumentation were caused by these electrical issues, there was no comment of, oh, hey, my instruments are displaying correctly now. There's also no comment of the instruments are still not displaying correctly. In either case, Dutton may not have really trusted his indications because he had been getting bad indications. And this pitot static systems don't always require electrical power. Again, I don't know the Citation II. Maybe they do on the Citation II. And so the electrical system may have solved his airspeed indications, may have solved some of these other indications, or it may have been completely independent. There could have been something else that happened. But whatever the case, he begins to turn to runway 28. The sun calls runway in sight. At some point, he gets slow, 99 knots indicated airspeed, and he keeps descending, decreased to 93 knots during the final 5 seconds of data. That's too slow. That's too slow in a Citation. Notably, his son sitting in the right seat, coming out of single engine, piston-powered aircrafts, 93 knots is blazing fast. You're not worried about slow speed at 93 knots in a single engine, piston-powered aircraft, light aircraft. No comments, no support, no nothing. Biffle in the rear seat may not have been able to see the airspeed indications on the son's gauges easily, if at all, so he would have had no comment on it. It's possible the only person who knew he had good gauges was just not doing anything to facilitate. Yeah, that's why you don't put someone who's not qualified, familiar with as an aircraft like a Citation II in the right seat, in the front right seat. he was the wrong guy to be in there, and obviously didn't make a statement of, hey, Pop, you're getting slow. And that's clearly going to be the primary cause of this, is loss of airspeed. They may say for undetermined reasons. There's no indication that there was an engine failure at this point. So Biffle Sr. maybe just didn't trust those gauges in front of him, wasn't really referencing him, was kind of locked in on the runway, approaching the runway through 5 statute miles of mist and low ceilings, and probably blood pressure pretty high at this point for everything that preceded it. Airplane got slow. At a certain point, you run out of energy, and there's nothing you can do to recover that energy. You're going to hit the ground, and that's what happened. They made ground contact. See some trees out here. They made ground contact, and then they slid, caught on fire, and then spun at the end of the runway here, and all tragically perished. Lesson from it for you pilot folks out there who watch the channel: be compliant with rules and policies. Don't be sentimental. Be safe. And for anyone out there who's watching this in general aviation, in corporate aviation, in the airlines, that should go without saying. So the first link in this chain was forged by putting someone unqualified in the right seat for understandable sentimental reasons. But sentiment has got no place in flight safety, and he shouldn't have been in that seat. And you couldn't expect him to perform in that seat. Anyways, that's a quick update. Everyone out there, stay safe. If you fly, don't make these types of decisions. This isn't about judgment for the individuals. I can understand some of the decisions they made on a personal level, on a human level. On a flight safety level, we have to differentiate sometimes, and we have to become a little bit cold and a little bit calculating and say, you just can't do that stuff and stay safe. And that's the most important thing here. So 7 fatals, tragic event. None of them deserved it. None of them I could look at and say we're doing anything that was absurd or not understandable, but it was not compliant with regulations. And they set themselves up. And then they just had a really unfortunate sequence of events. The weather degraded significantly. It put them in a bind. They were trying to maintain regulatory compliance. And then when they climbed into the clouds, there was this other issue with the flight instruments. Just a freak set of events. Any one of these issues you could have gotten away with. But when you put these issues together, it resulted in a fatal accident. It's very tragic. And we just want to learn the lesson from it. For those of you out there, this is what happened to Biffle, so you know what happened to him. Don't think too harshly on him or on the pilots in this flight. If you're in aviation, don't do what they did. Don't stack the deck against yourselves, because you never know when things are going to get complicated. And if you start stacking the deck against yourself, you may not be able to deal with the thing once it becomes complicated. So don't stack the deck against yourself. Convenience is a factor, and I don't want to bang on them too much for it. But when you have reduced ceilings, 3,900 foot broken, 4,800 foot overcast, maybe pick up that clearance on the ground, even if it's inconvenient. Or brief, hey, we're taking off VFR. What do we do if weather degrades? Anyways, thanks for watching. As always, God bless them. God bless the family members, and stay safe.